Hi, it's Carmen again. I know that many of you are home with younger children, and since my last lesson was ages 8 to 11, I wanted to at least put out a mini lesson that encompassed ages 4 with the help of an adult and up. I do plan on adding lessons that span a wider age range, but until I can get those filmed, I wanted to bring you a mini lesson where we're going to explore different watercolor techniques and see how watercolor reacts with different substances. Another good thing about this lesson is that if you're missing a material that I'm going to use, it's fine. You can use one of the squares to experiment with your own techniques and try something new. Okay, so I have my paper taped off. I've divided it into 6 uneven squares. I'm sorry if that's driving some of you nuts. I left my ruler at the Mary C, and I'm trying to limit my visits outside of the house right now. So I've got 9 squares. You could do 6, you could do 12, it's up to you. Okay, so for my first square, I'm using tube watercolors. If you have pan watercolors, that's fine. I'm still waiting on my pan watercolors to come in, so I'm going to use my tube watercolors. I'm going to take this blue, thin it down into a wash. In the first square, I'm not being super gentle. Just going to put a nice swatch of color here. Okay, now that I've got my blue in, I'm going to take some regular table salt. And I'm just going to sprinkle table salt on top of the swatch of blue and let it sit. And we will see how that reacts as it dries. For my next square, I'm going to take some oil pastels. If you have crayons, crayons work fine. I'm going to use some oil pastels and draw some designs in my squares. Any design you want. We're just going to look at how the watercolor resists the wax. I'm going to use some alizarin crimson, which is it's red. Mine's just a little cooler red. Just wash over the top here. I wasn't very careful, was I? I should have my palette on the other side, but I wanted you to be able to see it, and there's not a lot of room, so I might get a few drips here and there. So that's my second square. It's almost like a batik effect where the wax has resisted the water. And it's a pretty cool effect if you're doing watercolor. I personally love to use this one in drawings and paintings in class. I just think it looks cool. It's fun. The kids get a kick out of it. So that's one of my favorites. In my next square over here, I'm going to mix up I'm a little limited on my color, so I'm going to mix up a violet here. It looks nice next to that yellow. I'm not worried about being mixed evenly. I like it when there's some variation in there. And I'm going to take some rubbing alcohol. I know it's in short supply these days for many of us. If you have a little, it's only a few drops we're going to use. So I'm going to take some rubbing alcohol and let's see here. Gonna add a few drops to my painting here and see how it makes the watercolor disperse. I like this one too. It's a really cool effect. I like how it spreads and it's a nice visual texture. So in this square, I thought I was recording, but apparently I wasn't. I just did a light wash of yellow and sprinkled ground coffee into the square and let it sit. For this square, I'm taking masking tape and just laying it on the paper. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a second. For my square in the middle here, I've just taken some masking tape and torn it into strips. If you're using a thinner paper, you might want to skip this technique if you think the tape will tear the paper and try a different technique. I'm using a watercolor paper. As long as your paper can hold a light wash, it'll be fine. If you want to try to take some of the sticky off your tape, you can press the tape onto your clothes and pick up a little bit of lint first, and that will help it pull up easier. I'm just going to paint a light wash. See if I can make a gradient here. I'm gonna paint a light wash. These kind of look like tiger stripes, which I love, except for it will be white underneath and not black. But I liked that. Okay. For this square on the end, I'm going to take a yellow again, and I'm going to use a good bit of water. I want it to stay somewhat wet. I'm going to do a wet in wet technique. So while the paint is wet, I'm going to take another color of watercolor. I'm going to use blue. Just do some different dots and watch it spread. Nice wet and wet technique here. For the square on my bottom left, I'm going to take this nice violet again. And put a fairly watery wash of watercolor on here. And I'm going to take some plastic wrap. I didn't have saran wrap. I used a little bit of plastic that came off of a package that I got in the mail. I'm going to put this on top of here. Let's see, add a little more water here. I'm going to put this on top of here and just scrunch it up and set something on top of it to weigh it down while I wait for it to dry. You can see how some of the paint has gathered under these pieces of paper that are touching the paper, the pieces of plastic that are touching the paper. Saran wrap really works best for this. I just don't happen to have any at my house, so I had to improvise. Here's another one I like to do. I'm going to use this blue again. And I'm going to take a cut up piece of a, like, you know, the gift cards, the loyalty cards they give you. This is really cool if you're trying to make the appearance of rocks in a watercolor painting. And if your child is in my class, many of us, we've done the scraping technique before. It's fun, it's tactile. For my final square, I'm going to go back to this red. Oh, I think I need a little more. There we go. And I'm going to use a plain old paper towel, scrunched up, and add a little more here. This would make nice clouds if you were doing a watercolor painting and you had some little ones, you had a blue sky or maybe a nice sunset. You could make some nice looking clouds with this. And if you want to pull out a little more water or a little more pigment, add a little more water and dab again. Pulls out a little more pigment. Or you could teach them to do a nice gradient effect based on how they dab it out. So like I said, if you have extra squares, go ahead and make up your own, you know, see what's happening with different substances that you're trying to use with the watercolor. And it's just a nice experimental way. You never know when you're going to use it in another painting, and it's fun for the kids to do. They like to see the results. So I'm going to let this dry, and I will come back and pull up the tape in a bit. Okay, everything is mostly dry. I've gone ahead and pulled the tape up. I've knocked the salt off of here and brushed the coffee off. Ideally, the saran wrap would have dried a little more, but I wanted to go ahead and get this video out to you as soon as possible. I know that some of you have younger kids and you probably want an activity to do for the weekend, so I hope this is helpful. I'll be back next week with another lesson based on Georgia O'Keeffe's Ladder to the Moon. It should be suitable for ages 5 and up, you know, if you're supervising. If your kid's a little younger, you know your child, at least check the video out and see if it's something you could do. And I hope you guys have a good weekend. I'll be back next week.